Basically, the title itself came to me around 10 years down the line after the book had been written, actually. I think, see, the concept of a bubble is that each one is so uniquely individual. And if you look at a bubble, you'll see these colors which swirl around on the surface of the bubble, and it cannot be duplicated on any other bubble. So the bubble is very unique in itself. So I would consider what we are sharing here as a bubble in time, where our emotions, all the characters that are involved at this point of time in sitting in the same space would be contained within this bubble. And as we leave this room and we go out into our own worlds, we'll be creating new bubbles, because this bubble would have burst, never to be recreated, and we'll be creating our own bubbles separately in our own time. So that's why this book is called In a Bubble of Time. It spans from 14 BC to 28 AD, when history literally turned on its head, when BC became AD, as it were. So that is a very unique time, a unique span of time, where you could contain it in a bubble, because it has its own characters of its own. It is set in Palestine because time, as it were, or the change in time, as it were, happened there, because BC was before Christ and AD is after that. So obviously that is where history itself turned on its head. So that is where this whole book is positioned. And having said that, it's a historical novel. So I have taken what you could call the dry bones of history and attached the sinews and muscles of imagination to create life for this book. There are two main characters, two main protagonists in it. One is Deborah and the other one's Joanna, both women of substance who come from diversely different backgrounds. Deborah, for instance, is born and bred in Caesarea, which is uniquely a cosmopolitan Roman port of Israel, in Judea actually, whereas Joanna is a very humble farmer's daughter, born and brought up in Emmaus. That's one of the villages in Judea. To understand the geographical concept of this whole era of time, it's Israel and Palestine did not exist as it does today. We have the Roman Empire, which had conquered all the entire amount of, area of the known world, or civilized world as they considered it then. And in the middle of it, you have this little strip of land called Judea. But the Romans called it Palestine, and it was a collection of different countries. For instance, Syria and Judea and Idumea were three different countries then, which the Romans termed under a blanket of Palestine. But the Judeans, the Jews, refused to be known under any other identity except their own. So there lies the conflict of a race that refused to be conquered, and a country, an empire which thrived on conquest. And they expected everybody to take on their identity. For instance, when they went into Britain or into Germany, the Gauls were subdued by them. If you have read Asterix, you'd know that there was this little village that refused to give in to the Romans. But wherever the Romans went, they expected everybody to bow down and be accepted as part of the Roman Empire. Whereas Judea just absolutely refused. They wanted their own monotheistic religion, which is the worship of Yahweh, and they refused to accept any idols in their temple. And whereas the Romans came from a polytheistic kind of a religion, and they didn't feel averse to having idols anywhere. So there you have a constant conflict going on, constant. The Romans had coins with the face of the emperor on it, which the Jews refused to touch because they said they had a problem with idols. So they had a separate set of coins made, especially just for the Jews, so that the Jews wouldn't rebel so much. In fact, the Romans tried everything they could, almost practically bent over backwards trying to get the Jews to accept them, but the Jews never did. And in this space, in this bubble of time, is set this whole story. Using the Bible also as a source of history, because the Bible, I feel, describes that time period very intensely, very deeply, very graphically and detailed. So I've used the Bible as a historical reference. So there you find characters from the Bible also interspersing in this book. So you find Jesus, because he is also a historical figure, very much involved, very much a part of the society then. Deborah, because she is born and brought up in a cosmopolitan city, in spite of what her father may think, she had no qualms about mixing with the other races. She had Greek friends. She fell in love with a Roman centurion, terribly taboo in that day and age. And of course, it was not allowed. So you have a conflict of interest there. And so she was marched off by her father for a different fate, you could say. And Joanna, she was born in a village, a typical Jew. You couldn't get more Jew than her. But being a lady, a woman, she was not educated. But she had a radically different brother who would bring home news from the rabbi and teach her, and therefore enlighten her mind, as it were, to some extent. So she wasn't completely isolated either. But she had to follow tradition and marry according to her father's wishes. But because she had the support of her siblings, she broke free from them too, in a way, for some space of time. And because of what Rome and Herod and all of them decided at their levels, at their planes of existence, it affected Joanna's life, and she was sold into a life of slavery. And she somehow lands up in the court of Herod, and there her life takes an entire twist and a turn, and she's there at the beheading of John the Baptist. Through her eyes you see what could have happened, may have happened. And finally Deborah and Joanna meet because they meet one person in history who they have a common interest in, so they happen to meet together. And I took Joanna from the Bible because there's this obscure reference to a lady called Joanna who lived in Herod's court, just 2 verses. So I picked her out because she was an actual person, but created an entirely fictitious life around her. And there's also another reference where Joanna is found at the foot of the cross, standing with Mary, mother of Jesus. That was also a very interesting point to me, because I wondered, here was Herod, the Roman soldiers, the Roman court, everyone collaborating together to get Mary's son crucified. And yet at the foot of the cross, she's standing with a lady who comes from Herod's court. That was huge for me. I mean, that had opened up so many implications as to how they met and why would they stand together as friends at that time of crisis. Why would Joanna risk everything she had? Everything she had. I mean, her reputation, her husband's reputation, or her standing in court, whatever it was. Why would she risk everything to stand with this little Jewish lady at the foot of a cross when a mother had to watch her son die? Why? That itself was a lot of things you could do with that. It took me 2.5 years to research it alone, and 4 years to get the first draft done. And after that, in bits and pieces, actually I put the manuscript on the shelf because my children were growing up. My daughter was 2 years old when I was writing the book, and then life came in the way, you know, school and homework and growing up and everything. So the book was written in, after that, the second draft of it was done in bits and pieces. In fact, I remember I'd be either sitting in church or sitting in a restaurant, and suddenly this idea would come out of nowhere, and I'd either pick up a tissue paper or get a bill from somewhere, and, you know, from the back pocket, and scribble down whatever came to me and stick it in my book. My entire book was handwritten because I didn't know the computers much then and didn't have any access to it. So I had 3 whole foolscap books of written notes with all little bits and pieces all stuck here and there and all over the place, and that's how it was. And 16 years for it to get published actually, and now it's finally in the shelves. I don't know. I just wrote. I don't know what genre I fit in. I think it's a historical novel, so probably under history, but again, because there's so much of fiction in it, it's not a history book. But it could help you understand history, but there's a whole lot of romance and murder and betrayal, and also it's another novel too.